Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Tom Woods Show, episode 2494, with Auron McIntyre, who happens to be, by coincidence, the host of the Auron McIntyre Show over on The Blaze, and he is the author of a brand new book called The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyranny. So welcome back, man.
Thanks for having me.
All right, look, I was telling you before we record, I have a lot of authors on, and I generally don't have an author on if I hate the book, because I'm not an antagonistic person toward people who are more or less my friends. If they have a rotten book, I just pretend it didn't happen, more or less. But so unfortunately, this means that when I really, really like a book, I now lack the vocabulary to indicate that to people because I'm usually so enthusiastic. But I'll just say something. There are a lot of right-wing radio hosts or, quote-unquote right-wing radio hosts like Sean Hannity, who over the years wrote the dumbest books full of idiotic fluff of, about why the Democrats are a problem. And it would always be completely non-fundamental reasons. Like if you look at Bill O'Reilly, the reason he thinks Jesse Jackson is a problem is that he's got some questionable fundraising. It's stupid, missing the point nonsense. And yet those books would shoot to the top of the bestseller list. And so there are so many forgettable books out there that unfortunately the would-be right-wing masses wind up consuming because they don't know any better. They don't know any better. Well, I'll tell you something. This is a book that will stand the test of time. It's not long, but it is packed with the kinds of serious ideas that it's about time we started reckoning with. And if you haven't read but have heard the names, James Burnham, Sam Francis, Auron McIntyre, you haven't read those, this book's going to fill in some important gaps in your knowledge and give you a better understanding of what's really happening. Because what's really happening here is not that, if only we could just get back to the Constitution and listen to the Founding Fathers. And unfortunately, we've strayed. We're not children. We got to grow up from that. It's long past time that we get serious. So first of all, thank you for this. I appreciate this book very much.
Well, thank you. That's incredibly kind. And I do hope that it helps people because really this is just the story of my intellectual journey. I was one of these talk radio, Sean Hannity type guys, I worked a little bit of GOP politics and I had read some political theory, but in general, I kind of held to all of these bromides. And so the book is really just a story of me doing my best to grapple with the reality around me and trying to really understand how power worked in our situation rather than just kind of continue to consume, those platitudes. And so I just hope that it does the same thing for other people because it's really just me kind of telling people about the journey I went on.
Well, each chapter really builds on the previous one. In fact, sometimes at the end of the chapter, you're teasing what's about to come in the next chapter. So it really is a very nice step-by-step series of building blocks leading to a conclusion. Whereas a lot of my books, you can read them in the bathroom because you just read one chapter at a time, and they're not connected to each other. But this is really one carefully constructed edifice. So as you say, it does have a bit to do with you in terms of your own intellectual autobiography. So if we may, I'd like to start there with exactly how you first came to confront these ideas, and you identify 2020 as being a particularly important turning point. So, for anybody who wasn't around, what happened in 2020?
Well, yeah, like a lot of people, I came up with Rush Limbaugh and, civics classes about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and separation of powers and how all of that was going to guarantee our freedom in perpetuity and stand up to government tyranny for us. And I believed a lot of that stuff. And of course, I worked a little bit in Republican politics. I was a political reporter for a while. Once I saw what was happening with Trump and the way that the media was lying and manipulating stories, I started to get an inkling that something was wrong, but I still mostly held on to my conservative bromides. And then I got to 2020 and we see this huge break, right? Like the churches are closed, but the strip clubs are open. We can't go see our loved ones in their funerals, but the Democrats can riot and drink champagne in the streets when Joe Biden is selected. And all of a sudden, this all kind of falls apart. And so what I realized was that just power didn't work the way that it had been explained to me. And I needed to understand this. And this sent me on a journey of first reading this guy called Curtis Yarvin, and he had this kind of more political realist understanding of how the United States was constructed. But importantly, he also had a large list of influential political thinkers, starting with James Burnham, but going to people like Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca and Bertrand de Juvenal. And these people all explained in a very succinct way that power has a particular way it manifests itself, and the United States is not immune to these facts. And if we can better understand how these get applied, and the fact that actually the founders understood these things, and we seem to have largely forgotten even the fact that the founders were aware of many of these forces, and we've gotten kind of a cartoon version of what they believed and understood about people and government and power. That's really what I discovered after watching pretty much all these systems fall apart in 2020.
Well, there's so many insights in this thing that as I said to you on Twitter, I think we might have to do more than one episode. But one of the important contributions of Bertrand de Juvenal, who has that book on power that you referred to in your book, also another great book on sovereignty, is he describes what let's say the polity looked like before the modern era. And in the modern era, it's like we have a single undifferentiated flat plane. Whereas before this time, before, let's say, the French Revolution, we had more like a series of levels, you might say. And so we didn't just have a big mass of individuals and that was it. We had different social forces who had power and interests that they brought to the table. And the way you put it in the book is, when we talk about today, instead of different societal forces with different bases of power being forced to the table and checking each other's interests, power becomes dependent on one source, public opinion, in some way influencing, we might say brainwashing if we want to be provocative, this undifferentiated mass of indistinguishable individuals, this giant blob and we've been taught to believe that this giant blob is the social representation of liberty because it's no longer constrained by an aristocracy or by local forms of tyranny that we've all managed to wipe out. Now we're all free and equal. We all get one vote. What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly. It used to be that societies were constructed in a much more organic way. You have these different families forming tribes, and these different tribes coming together into different smaller civilizations. And when that happened, that meant that people were dependent on these organic social spheres, the family, the church, the community, the tribe. These were all smaller regional forces. And yes, you had an overall state, but the state was restricted by what it could do and what it could demand of the individual, because the individual wasn't just dependent on the state. They were plugged in and had their identity informed by all these different social spheres. And so when Montesquieu talked about the different branches of government, the separation of powers, he wasn't talking about some mechanical thing where if we just get like 3 branches of government, they perfectly counterbalance each other due to the properties of the machine we've set up. What he was explaining is that each one of these should represent different social hierarchies inside our society, and that because each one derives its power in a different way, and because it demands a different type of loyalty, the interests check the interests and they hold back tyranny, because no one part of society can ever completely demand the total loyalty of the individual. But when we break that apart and we break people out of those societal bonds, yes, they feel free for a moment because they no longer have to, say, educate their children or take care of their ailing grandparents or provide safety for their family. So they feel like they have all this free time, they have this liberty, this freedom in some ways. But all of those responsibilities don't go away. The thing I really found, the thing that was truly a revolution in my understanding of liberty, is that we are always dependent on each other. We are always, our entire society is formed by dependence and duty. And that's why the ancient conception of liberty was always one bound inside a community. Aristotle knew that you couldn't pursue liberty. You couldn't have liberty if you didn't pursue virtue. And you couldn't pursue virtue unless you were part of a community. And it is those communities and our pursuit of virtue in those communities that eventually allow us to build a society that features liberty. But liberty is the fruit of that tree. It is not what creates the actual virtue. And so I found that when we handed all of these social spheres and all of these dependencies over to the state, we actually just became subject to, like you said, this mass propaganda that could be wielded on the large scale, the wide franchise. And that just becomes a sledgehammer against the individual and allows for the totalitarian state to step in.
Now, I'll say in parentheses, we can get to this later, if human nature were different from what it is, this might not be so dangerous. If everybody were absolutely committed to uncovering the truth, regardless of how popular or unpopular it is, I would be less fearful about this arrangement. But anyway, we can get back to that later. I want to say something about the Constitution, because again, the U.S. Constitution has been a rallying point for conservatives and to some extent libertarians for a long time. And some of them revere this document. I mean, almost as if it's a sacred thing. Now, if it had been me, the kind of argument I would have made to those people would be to say that no piece of paper enforces itself, that the general public can very easily be corrupted by, for example, receiving checks with their names on them in the mail, and that is a little bit more immediate to them than the abstract fidelity to some old document. And I would say also that there's no particular reason that people in power under the Constitution would want to stick to the strict interpretation of it in Jefferson's formulation, because why would they? I mean, of course they want to interpret every clause as broadly as possible, even though Madison, it's true, refuted all of those expansive interpretations. None of that matters to somebody who's ambitious. And it's the ambitious who tend to get in power. So you are demanding an awful lot of this particular piece of paper. That's the way I would have argued it. But I think that your argument about what the fatal flaw of the written Constitution of the U.S. is much deeper than mine. So can you talk about it a bit?
Well, I'm just drawing from the work of Joseph de Maistre, and what Joseph de Maistre said is that no man has ever written a political constitutions, that all constitutions are actually written by God onto the hearts of men, because constitutions are only ever a organic instantiation of a way of being, a tradition, a continuity of life that arises from a people, and no individual person creates this in and of itself. They are simply the culmination of these forces and these influences. And so ultimately a constitution is only as good as you say of those who enforce it, not because, there's some kind of flaw somewhere in the actual document. It's not because the words on the paper, it's not as if we had a slightly more specific commerce clause, we would suddenly, fix this and everything would fall into place. It's that constitutions can only ever capture for a moment what a people are and what they believe and how they think that they should relate to each other or relate to government, and how government should treat them and how they should respond and what should be the restraints on its power and all of these things. And so if we lose sight of that, if we ask of the Constitution that it change who we are as people, that it dictate our behavior, we've misunderstood what a constitution is. If we change the people, if we lose the virtue, if we lose the community, if we lose the history and tradition, the animating metaphysical spirit that makes a people who they are, then no words on a piece of parchment is ever going to change that. And we have truly gone through a process of radically changing what America is and who Americans are. In fact, our politicians tell us, Barack Obama says, I am looking to do exactly that, right? I am looking to radically change the American, to change who the Americans are, and therefore I will change their constitution. And I think that is the failure. It's not that the Constitution in of itself had this perhaps fatal flaw, though there is, I think, a misunderstanding of the way that democracy would end up limiting government, popular sovereignty, these kind of things. But it's that there's a larger issue in that we don't understand what we were asking of the Constitution in the first place. It was not meant to rule a global empire. It was meant to rule a very specific people with a very specific way of being and a very specific tradition. And once we asked it to do something else, it inevitably failed at that task.
Hey, everybody, one of the great things the COVID lockdowns and restrictions took from us was the unforgettable annual event that economist Bob Murphy and I hosted from 2016 to 2019, the Contra Cruise. Well, Bob prefers to stay on land at the moment, but with his blessing, I am announcing the Tom Woods Cruise. Remember from the Tom Woods show, Clifton Duncan, the Broadway actor who paid a devastating professional price for declining the COVID shots, but who's now creating a one-man show on the life and ideas of Thomas Sowell? Well, he's joining us too, and we'll get to hear his stunning singing voice that I bet you didn't even know he had. The first 50 people to sign up can join me on a special excursion on Roatan, Honduras, to a free private city there, of the kind the ambitious Free Cities movement has been promoting and that I've discussed on the Tom Woods Show. It's the closest thing to Ancapistan in our world today. Each of the first 50 people will also join me for dinner one night during the week. We're also going to put on the biggest murder mystery party I've ever held. And I have other great special guests joining us, including Scott Horton, as well as Paul Counts, who directs my mastermind programs, so all you business folks will have a chance to pick his brain during the week. We depart from Galveston, Texas on February 23rd, 2025, and return 1 week later on March 2nd. Make sure you're one of the first 50, and I'll see you on board. The website is tomwoodscruise.com. I want to bring up something that, as we move into talking about Carl Schmitt and value neutrality, that I reproach myself for not getting this, for taking so long to figure this out. That the liberal project, and by that we're talking about classical liberalism. So we are talking about not Hillary Clinton, but the heroes of some people listening to this, like John Locke and others, who would be considered to be the architects of liberalism in the European sense anyway. What they seem to be implicitly or explicitly saying was that, human society has been vexed by a lot of difficult questions that may be unresolvable. Theological questions have divided people and led to conflict in society and prevented the emergence of peace. Or even metaphysical questions, or questions about, who man is, like what and what his purpose is. These things might be interesting to reflect on, but we can't make them into the basis of society because there are a lot of different possible answers, and we'll just be at each other's throats forever. So how about instead we have a philosophically neutral public square where people of all different perspectives, whether theological or philosophical, can meet together, buy and sell things, exist side by side in a spirit of goodwill, and just take a neutral stance publicly with regard to these vexed questions. And there's a part of you that thinks, I do think these are very important questions, but on the other hand, it seems like an appealing idea that we can at least nevertheless live together in peace together. But the problem with that, one of the problems with that is the idea that there's going to be a neutral public square is simply a myth. That's not the way people in power ever act. It will never be neutral. They'll portray it that way to bring you on board with the seemingly attractive prospect of a peaceful society, but it's going to be their values in that public square, and people who persist in insisting that the public square is neutral or is supposed to be neutral are just going to get steamrolled by the people who actually wield the power and who are in fact going to impose an ideology and a philosophy on that public square.
Yeah, that's right. Carl Schmitt makes us stare at a very hard truth, stare it in the face. And the fact is that someone will always be in charge, that you cannot actually escape the truth that there will always be a sovereign. And what he tells us is that liberalism sold a false bill of goods. And like you said, important to understand this is classical liberalism, not like American progressivism in 2024. And the lie that classical liberalism told us is that, well, we have these messy conflicts of core beliefs, right? We have these fundamental axioms that are bedrocks of, who is God? What is the divine? What is the good? And these things can't actually be negotiated verbally. We can't put them in a marketplace of ideas because they are core to our way of being. And so they can only ever really be resolved through physical conflict. And we'd prefer not to be in all these religious wars. So what we're going to do is we're going to shove all those existential questions into the broom closet. And that'll allow us to go ahead and trade with each other and, have these large institutions and build these empires. And to be really fair to liberalism, it had a pretty good run. Like it did a lot of these things. We obviously have incredible material wealth, and we have a high level of productivity, and we have many benefits from this system. But the problem is that at the end of the day, it was, as you point out, a lie. It never really actually put those questions in the closet. It simply substituted its own answers and presented them as neutral. It defined what would be the null hypothesis. And because it got to do that, we kept pretending like we were fighting it out in the battlefield of ideas, but really the answers were already decided before we ever stepped onto that battlefield. And that's why conservatives and libertarians often feel so defeated. They come in and think, oh, well, I've got all the right answers. I remember reading something from one of the Reagan staffers in the 80s saying, we thought that the answer to this, the solution is that we had all the correct answers. And if we just stacked enough facts and logic, facts don't care about your feelings, bring the arguments, then we ended up winning this. And what we quickly learned is that actually there was a system in place that made sure we never won any of these battles. And Carl Schmitt is just letting us know that ultimately we can't escape these existential questions. And that's scary because what the logical conclusion of that fact is we will go to war over these things. There will be real and dangerous conflict over these issues. And that's a terrifying thing to say out loud. But ignoring it only makes us slaves to those who realize the truth. And that's what it really brings forward is ultimately there are no neutral institutions. Someone will rule you. Their ideas will reign supreme. And if they're not yours, then you will end up being subject to those that actually control these public squares.
Well, as a result, in part, of insights like this, some people, and this I don't think is central to your argument, but some people have argued that maybe the correct approach is to try to get people on board with the idea of a really radical decentralization so that you can have your set of ideas and I can have mine, but so we won't pretend that there's quote unquote neutrality, but we just won't have a single state ruling over both of us, that maybe you have yours and I have mine. And this will be messy because there'll still be people who agree with me over with you and vice versa, but maybe this could finally give us peace, that you take groups that at least have enough in common, the way they look at the world, that they could probably get along with each other. But the problem here now is that there's at least one side of this whole argument that can't just leave well enough alone. It would be a betrayal of their worldview to leave well enough alone. They have to be on a crusade. They have to spread the same way the French Revolution had to spread French revolutionary ideas all over the place. It would be like that to ask progressives to just lay down their arms, move to California, have all the universal health care you want, and leave everybody else alone. That's not the way they think, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, this question can be answered pretty quickly. How does the United States feel about states that don't engage in democracy? Right? Like, well, what's the answer anytime they come into conflict? Oh, that's not a democracy. We have to go knock them over until they fall under our system. And that answer is really that the thing that the liberal system is trying to do, and the larger managerial elite system is trying to do, is create a massive global system of hegemony that allows them to go ahead and maximize their efficiency and the application of their managerial techniques. And so they're never going to leave you alone. Like, you can't just do the 1,000 Liechtenstein thing, right? Like that's not actually how this works, because ultimately the people who want to win will beat the people who want to be left alone. They're not just going to allow you to create your utopia over there and pretend like they don't care about the way that you conduct yourselves. Now, I think ultimately we will see a fracturing of our large global empires. I think that the scale of human organization that we've engaged in is ultimately unsustainable. I think there will be a radical decentralization, but it won't be some kind of voluntary negotiation that everyone realizes is the best way to mediate our conflicts. No. It'll only be because those in power become so incompetent that they can no longer operate the massive leviathans that they've created. And so I do think a focus on the local and kind of that sphere of sovereignty will matter, but ultimately not because we've negotiated the settlement that allows us to do our own thing and believe our own thing, but because material necessity has kind of disassembled these massive leviathans that are built by the liberal democratic kind of a global order.
Right. It'll happen because the system doesn't work anymore and has broken down, not because we meet each other and say, well, how about we try it this way?
Right.
It'll happen because it happens. So you point out in your book that the state could, we suppose, or it's at least within the realm of possibility that the state could simply engage in like it has the brute force to engage in mass censorship, but it's not going to do that because even a lot of people let's say on the left, might even object to that. And a lot of people would say that was way over the top. So it has to be, I mean, yes, we have seen examples, like we all know about during COVID, there were some voices that were suppressed, and we know that there were people who were identified by name by the Biden White House. I mean, there's a Supreme Court case going on related to that. But by and large, what we've seen developing within our lifetimes is something quite different. It's a kind of a management of society that is more subtle than a massive censorship or re-education campaign in concentration camps. And in a way, I do like Noam Chomsky's phrase, the manufacturing of consent, because that is actually what's gone on. So it is more subtle. I think your chapter is called something like engineering subjects for the total state. How does that proceed?
Well, I think that, in the book, I talk about the idea of lions versus foxes, right? The two archetypes of any ruling elite. You have the strong, martial, patriotic, traditional lions, and then you have the quick, manipulative, clever foxes. And we are in a society that is completely ruled by foxes, but we identify totalitarianism with the lions. We think of Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, and of course, you're going to have jackboots on your neck and you're going to go to the gulag. But what the foxes have done is far more resilient. They've created a system that is more about nudging than it is shoving. And what they end up doing is feeding us a constant drip of propaganda, to be sure, but they do it in voluntary ways. You've got your Netflix subscription, you're scrolling your social media feed, you're reading your news, and you think you're making voluntary decisions in all of these interactions, but you're not. This has all been coded by a decentralized oligarchy who is distributing this information to you on a regular basis and censoring what you can see and what you can do. And of course, you know where the bright lines are. You know that if you say certain things online or don't say certain things online, that's going to trigger some questions with your boss and your spouse and your kids. And, maybe you'll lose your ability to do banking. Maybe you'll lose your ability to be employed. Maybe you'll have a hard time finding a house. All of these things are not authoritarian in the sense that someone's going to come kick in your door and lock you up, throw a bag on your head, disappear you to a black site, though that is increasingly does seem like something that the state is willing to reach for. But this softer form of totalitarianism is much more resilient at a larger scale. However, it does have some weaknesses, and I think we saw that in COVID when you have this decentralized information system. While it does have its own drawbacks, the regime can use it to monitor you and manipulate you. It also does allow the truth to get through on a very regular basis. You and I don't have to be on CNN or Fox News to have this conversation. We can share these insights with people, even though we don't have any of the mainstream apparatus platforms people used to rely on. And so I think that increasingly the information monopoly that the regime used to rely on is cracking up. And that's why it's sending them into these histrionics about misinformation and disinformation, because they realize they're losing their grip in some of these things. And that is dangerous because their power is soft and therefore fragile. If they don't constantly have the ability to manipulate your inputs and control, say, your income, eventually they will lose the ability to guide the masses to where they want to be.
Folks, it's your old friend Woods to remind you that it's springtime, a time when we're doing things for our families like spring cleaning, planning outdoor activities. But the most important thing you can do for your family this spring, or any other time for that matter, is to shop for life insurance using Policy Genius. Remember the safety net life insurance provides. If something were to happen to you, your family could cover expenses while getting back on their feet, and Policy Genius will help you do that. I have tremendous peace of mind because my family is fully provided for with my life insurance policy, and it's much less expensive than you think. But move quickly because it does increase in price as you get older. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Even if you already have a life insurance policy through work, it may not offer enough protection for your family's needs, and it may not follow you if you change jobs. With just a few clicks, you'll be comparing quotes from top insurers to find your lowest price. The licensed award-winning agents at Policy Genius can help you find the best fit for your needs. They work for you, not the insurance company. So they don't have an incentive to recommend one insurer over another. No wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Save time and money and give your family a financial safety net with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description or on the show notes page to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com. Well, this is something that I was saying before that, and I realize it is unavoidable that I'm going to sound like an elitist here, but I guess I just don't care anymore. Like, why would I care? But I don't care about whatever name they call me. I don't even look anymore. But if the human race were a certain way, this wouldn't concern me as much. But there seems to be a very, very substantial portion, probably a majority, that almost seems to want to be led. That you present them with all the information you need about the lockdown regime being useless, and it just doesn't matter to them. They want to call the police on you, and getting to the bottom of that. I'm not even sure I need to get to the bottom of that. It's a brute fact of our existence that people seem to be that way, or they just want to have the opinions that their idols in entertainment have, or they just don't want to be on the outs. They don't have the stuff that an Auron McIntyre is made of, who can take the slings and arrows that come from being a dissident. Not everybody has that. They'd rather just get along with everybody, not be called a hater, and just go along to get along. That if we didn't have that, a lot of this manipulation wouldn't even matter.
There's that great scene in The Dark Knight, or one of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, where the Joker says, "You ever notice that as long as there's a plan, everybody's fine, but the minute there's not a plan, everybody loses their mind, and it doesn't matter how terrible the plan is, as long as there's a plan, that's what really matters." And that's a far deeper insight to human nature than I think a lot of people would expect from a comic book movie, but It's absolutely true. And this is something that I think libertarians and conservatives get wrong because they are obsessed with this idea of self-government and popular sovereignty. The cold hard truth is that people will be ruled. That's going to happen. And you can not like that about humanity. You can find that weak. You can find that distasteful. You can say that you want to create a society where that's not the case. But that is as utopian as communism. That is as delusional about the truth of human nature and as a denial of human nature as any wild Marxist theory has ever been. The truth is people will be ruled. The truth is that people do follow heroic archetypes and leaders. And the question is not, will they do this? The question is, who will stand in the gap, right? Who will be these people that they are looking at? They will look up social hierarchy. They will mimic those things. They will follow the leader. And so the question is, who leads? And we have largely built this classical liberal temple to the idea that there will be no leader, that we will be ruled by a system, no men, no gods, no kings. We will be ruled by this machine. We will be ruled by this constitution. We will be ruled by these neutral institutions. But that is all a lie, as we already discussed with Carl Schmitt. And at the center of every one of these things is a man making decisions. And we have to deal with that fact, no matter how uncomfortable it is, and deal with the political reality attached to it. And that means probably understanding that people will always be this way and not hating them or looking down on them for it, but ultimately understanding that a good ruler sees this in people, recognizes this, and then provides them something that is worthy of.
We've seen over the past few years the dangers of what's sometimes been called scientism, where science has its place, but it's not a worldview. Well, actually, no, I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. It is a worldview. It's the wrong one, but it is a worldview. Because if you make a worldview out of it, then you are basically saying that the only knowledge that's valuable comes out of a test tube, or the only knowledge that's valuable comes from things that are observable. And what's funny about that, by the way, is that a lot of the same people who will say that also believe very passionately in quote-unquote equality of human beings. And yet no test tube is going to prove that proposition.
Right.
To the contrary, it will show you the opposite every single time. But leave that aside. What we've had is there are people who think that that if you don't think science is the answer to everything, then you're a dumb, religious, backward idiot. It's really, the conversation is held at that level. The point is, there are a lot of questions that no test tube can answer, and we've seen them in our own day. Some of them are as simple as, how should we balance the alleged benefits from locking society down with all the damage we're going to do to society? There's no test tube that answers that. It's a philosophical question about what your values are. But people are, for some reason, we've got this idea of scientists as constituting a new priesthood of sorts. So that seems to start. In fact, that's what I want to talk about now. Is the idea that science can be the answer to everything. We've been arguing about all these crazy metaphysical questions. So in effect, we're gonna define these questions away. Because science can't answer them, they don't exist. All we have is matter in motion. That's your worldview.
Yeah, exactly. This is this works in tandem, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, of course. And so the same flaw that exists in classical liberalism also exists in this version of scientism that you're explaining. The first thing the French Revolution did was not get rid of God, but replace it with the goddess of reason, right? That's what they put in Notre Dame. And the same thing is happening here. You're not swapping out the religion. You're not getting rid of the truth about the metaphysical. Instead, you're simply substituting a new set of priests and a new set of doctrines into this. And what you end up with is a disastrous epistemology where you can't understand things because you think everything can be reasoned through by just bringing out scientific data. And this ends up in what Thomas Carlyle called the government by steam, where you would have this idea that you just have these brute facts, you just had these scientific truths, and they were self-evident things for which no decision would be necessary. You simply need to filter them through the experts. And this is what would produce governance going forward. And this is how we get the managerial revolution. This is how we get the administrative state, because we remove all the human factors, all the actual decision-making, all the messy business of politics, thinking that we can simply substitute this managerial scientific structure. We just go to the experts. You don't need Donald Trump to run the country. You hand it over to Dr. Fauci when there's a pandemic, right? You don't need Donald Trump to lead a war. You hand it over to the generals who end up committing treason and ignoring the president when it's time to manage a military conflict. There's no actual executive. There's no real leadership. Ultimately, all authority is distributed into these nameless, faceless organizations, and they can always just appeal to the science in the same way that a Catholic priest would have appealed to Holy Scripture at the end, except, the priest might actually have some truth bound into it. And so we end up in the scenario where we feel like we've made progress, right? It's the lie of progress. We've advanced beyond all these things about human nature, but it's just not the case. And that deceit, that deception leads us into a disastrous situation because we think we no longer need to address problems that are fundamental to the human condition, but it's still there and that clock is still ticking. And if we don't address it, other people rule us by recognizing the truth inside of it.
One of the things that follows from this, that you spend a little time talking about, is what you call or others have also called, the medicalization of deviance. So if I think about the French materialists of the 18th century, they would have said, if they had washing machines, they would have said, we don't assign moral agency to a washing machine because it just does what we tell it to do when we press the button. But if human beings are basically just nothing but a bunch of atoms floating around, then how can we assign moral blame there? Maybe we say we prefer that they do this rather than that, and we try to push them in a direction that makes them do this rather than that. But this gets caught up in the idea that if let's say you gamble all your money away that should have been spent on your kids and your household, we would have said that's a moral failing. But if you're just a bunch of chemicals floating around in a brain, then instead that becomes a condition that, don't worry, that the scientists have figured out how to treat. How does this, because this is a very interesting and very widespread phenomenon now. It's like nobody's to blame for anything. You're addicted to drugs. Well, that's beyond your control. We can't blame you for that. And you screw all your friends and you are a drain on society, and we can't blame you for that. Okay, that's a whole separate conversation, but I want to know, where does it fit into your thesis?
Well, the key thing about the medication of deviancy is it moves things out of the sphere of the sacred and into the sphere of the material. And like we said, this is a critical function. There's a critical transition that transfers power into the total state, into the managerial state. Because if these problems are spiritual in nature, right? If you were cheating on your wife or addicted to drugs or you had a gambling problem, it used to be that you went to a priest. That was the solution. These people dealt in the sphere of the moral, and they were the ones that could offer you solutions to this problem. But if instead all of this is simply, like you said, a problem of wiring, you're just a computer that has been improperly wired, and it's really about sorting out the chemical solutions inside of you, then really this transfers the solution outside of that sphere of the sacred and into the sphere of the experts. And that means that along with the solutions, you're also transferring the power. Because as we pointed out earlier, it's the opposing social spheres that check the power of government. It's never some constitutional restriction. It's actually the interest checking interest from an organic societal sense. And so if the answer to critical questions of human issues resides in the spiritual, well, then the church and the family and these things retain a certain power that the state can never wield. But if they get moved into the realm of the medical, well, now these things become a function of the state. And the beauty of this is they can, of course, once again, hide the ball in the idea of neutrality. So if we pretend that all of this deviancy is just an issue of medication, then yes, okay, none of these things are your fault. But you notice that actually racism is still bad?
Yeah, I was going to raise that point. You would say, but wait a minute, isn't he just genetically programmed to be that way?
Right. Wouldn't in-group preference be something that's genetically programmed? Or say a male who wants to have a physically fit and attractive female? Oh no, you need to get comfortable with beauty at any size. Well, why? Like, if you're saying we're just animals and we're just this chemical mixture and we're just hardwired this way, why would, say, homosexuality be something that's okay because it's hardwired, but racism or the preference for a physically fit mate would not be okay, even those things are also hardwired? And the answer is because ultimately the experts get to decide which hardwired things are acceptable and which ones need to be ameliorated through these processes. And so what we find is, once again, lurking behind that neutral institution and that incredibly scientific understanding of the world hides a man making a decision, imposing his view of the world onto us. And we never get to escape that, even if we're stepping into the realm of the medical, where we thought this objective rule was always the case. We find once again that actually it's the imposition of a worldview, values, axioms, and metaphysical understanding that ends up coming through this medicalization of deviance.
Do you think I'm correct to say that, because I have a follow-up to this, that the central promise of the liberal state was peace and security? Was it that? It's not to make you a better person. It's not to make you more pious or more erudite or more ethical or anything like that, virtuous. It's just to create a sphere of peace and security.
I would say it's peace, prosperity, and progress. Those would be the things that I think were offered. You will no longer have to deal with existential conflict. You will have material wealth, and we will always advance. You get sold this idea that you are morally and intellectually superior to that which came before you, and that's what enables the eternal revolution. Not in the Marxian, it's a Marxian type of eternal revolution, but instead it's based on this liberal idea of progress instead of necessarily the utopian, though the Marxist offshoot is, of course, very, very closely connected.
Well, the reason I put it that way is there is a Sam Francian phenomenon that I don't think you use the term, but you do employ the concept a bit in the book, anarcho-tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would like to contrast the anarcho-tyranny that I think we do live under with the initial promise of the liberal state.
Yeah, so anarcho-tyranny is interesting. It's Sam Francis's probably now most popular idea. It's used by guys like Tucker Carlson at this point. However, it's really just one essay, right? Of all the things he wrote these massive tomes of political theory. But this idea is the one that's caught on so much. And I think that's the case because it really does describe the situation we're in so succinctly. Sam Francis's whole thesis in this was that basically the government gets to use this criminalization of normal law-abiding behavior as a way to threaten those that have kind of make up the bourgeoisie middle class, the kulaks, the middle Americans, those that have that have things that the state wants to take. They can constantly lock them into this idea that they are violating the law at all times, right? The IRS is there really to just let you know you're always a criminal. You're not allowed to know, they know how much money you owe, but you're not allowed to know how much money you owe. And if you get it wrong, you've just broken the law. And there's so many things like this, right? Your own self-defense, your own, going to church in the middle of the pandemic. These are all violations of the law, even though you're a law-abiding citizen. But the people who are rioting, the people who are looting, the people who are shoplifting, they're allowed to continue to do whatever they want all of the time. And this obviously violates the promise of order and security and peace, because you're constantly under the system of terror. But what has happened is that I think people have, the elites we have now have gotten kind of to the end of their promise of prosperity. They realize that they're kind of running out of the ability to continue to provide the material promises and the promises of prosperity and security that they had previously offered. And so instead of continuing to do that, they've really just decided to sell their core constituency the idea that if they're not constantly listening to the state, if they're not holding on to the breath of whatever propaganda is being uttered at any moment, then eventually they will go ahead and be subject to the kind of the zombie masses that the state is wielding under anarcho-tyranny. And so while we were promised this idea of safety and prosperity under classical liberalism, what we see at the end of this, kind of the natural decay of this, is the elites simply tearing the copper wire out of the walls of the abandoned building in an attempt to get the last little bit of material benefit from those that once held any kind of influence in their society, while offering all these benefits to the client classes that they let loot and riot and run free in society.
There's a lot more to talk about because we haven't quite gotten to the end of the story. But I think I'm going to call it quits here and ask if I can get you to come back sometime in the not too distant future.
Oh, more than happy to.
Because there's so much else to talk about. But in the meantime, I'll let people know that in the description of the video, as well as at tomwoods.com/2494, you'll find a link to pick up a copy of The Total State, How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies. Well, Auron, thanks so much for your time, and I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Really appreciate it.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.